Hi there and welcome to the video. I'm your host, John Ivison. This week I'm joined by Steve Verheul, who was once described as the most important Canadian you've probably never heard of. For those who are in tune with what's going on, Steve was Canada's chief trade negotiator from 2017 to 2021, responsible for negotiating not only the new NAFTA deal with the Trump administration, but also the Canada and European Union trade agreement, which was the climax of a 34-year career in the public service, including being Canada's chief agricultural negotiator in the early 2000s. He's now a principal at government relations and strategic planning firm GT and Company. And Steve, I'd like to thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.
So the original impetus for this discussion, from my point of view at least, was that what would a second Trump administration mean for Canada-U.S. trade relations? But I guess it should be noted that the new NAFTA or the USMCA deal is up for renewal in 2026, regardless of who the president is. And I'd like to kind of unravel the issues that might mean that is not as plain sailing as we might wish it to be. Mm-hmm. Can we start by just gauging how successful USMCA has been for the US, for Canada, and for Mexico? Because I guess those things are not the same.
Mm-hmm. No, that's true. And I think overall, it's operated as we would have expected it to operate. Not a big change from NAFTA in many ways, but there have been some tensions going on since the agreement came into effect. There's been a number of dispute settlement panels, and probably most importantly, a couple of panels against Canada on dairy from the U.S., and a key panel from Mexico and Canada against the U.S. on autos.
But has trade gone up? I guess that's the ultimate gauge, I guess, is whether we've seen trade increase.
Yes, we have seen trade increase fairly significantly, but this was a transition from a NAFTA, which was a free trade agreement that was operating fairly effectively and had almost everything duty-free trade. And the new agreement similarly has almost everything duty-free trade. So there are some areas where there are tensions, as you'd expect, but the bulk of the agreement has been operating as we would have expected.
So if we could just break down some of those potential areas of discord. Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess in a trading relationship this size, you would expect some, but there do seem to have been some old problems coming back and some new ones. Yes. The one that was most recent and most public was the fact that 23 Republican and Democratic senators sent a letter to Justin Trudeau saying that they were concerned and profoundly disappointed that Canada won't reach 2% spending on defence this decade.
Yes.
And in their letter, they linked trade opportunities to defence spending, and we know that Donald Trump has been very vocal on this issue. Is our perceived shortfall in defence spending in danger of having knock-on effects on the trade relationship?
Well, I think it's probably always possible, but trade agreements are generally kept entirely separate from any kind of defense discussions and defense spending and defense obligations, particularly under NATO. So they don't really interfere in the trade discussions. There's always a fairly bright line between trade and defense issues.
One other thing that you mentioned the dairy issue, which has been the subject of two panels. This is one of the biggest headaches that I think we felt had been resolved. It seems it's back with a vengeance. US dairy farmers arguing that they have not been able to access what they thought they had negotiated, which I think was about 3.5% of the Canadian market.
Right.
The panel in November sided with Canada,
mm-hmm.
but the Americans don't seem to have given up on that challenge. Is there a central problem here? I mean, I know that New Zealand also felt that it didn't get what it thought it had got. And the reason in their case was that the Canadian government was allowing its own dairy processors to stipulate the imports. So have we got a problem that needs to be looked at again here?
Well, I think from a Canadian perspective, Canada probably feels like it's resolved the problem, given the dispute settlement decision came down in favor of Canada's approach as being consistent with the obligations under the agreement. Now, the U.S., and it's not a dissimilar issue with New Zealand, have been saying that they still aren't satisfied with the outcome of that dispute and are still looking for something more. And I think the biggest concern I would have at this point is that U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai has suggested that perhaps this issue needed to be addressed in the upcoming review of the agreement. And I think the notion that you might want to reverse or overturn dispute settlement decisions through a negotiating process is not a good signal to send at this stage. That very much undermines confidence in the not only dispute settlement but in the agreement overall, I would say.
Could the entire deal be renegotiated post 2026?
I think that's very unlikely because I think by and large the three parties are comfortable with the agreement. So there could be issues that might be reopened, which would be significant enough. But all of those issues that no one ever talks about, those are all operating as we would expect they would. So we're talking about a handful of issues that are contentious.
Well, one of those, something that came up every time I ever talked to the U.S. Ambassador David Cohen was is Canada's digital services tax, which is currently before Parliament.
Yes.
This is a 3% tax that the Americans consider a de facto tariff on tech giants like Alphabet and Amazon. Mm-hmm. Now, my reading of the USMCA was that it barred any of the countries from import taxes on music, software, electronic products. Are we going to be in breach of the deal if we, as seems likely, bring in a digital services tax? And although it's going to bring in, the Parliamentary Budget Officer estimated $7.2 billion in revenue, are we likely to be subject to retaliation?
Well, there's certainly been some in the U.S. that have talked about that, particularly in the U.S. Congress, that they would want to see some kind of retaliation for that. Whether it's outside of the rules or not, I think would have to be determined by a dispute settlement panel, because countries do have the right to impose taxes as long as they're consistent with the obligations in the agreement.
Right.
Now, with the DST, there's also the discussions going on at the OECD to try to reach a broader multilateral approach to these types of taxes. And those discussions are reaching potentially a conclusion over the next month or so. So a lot will depend on whether that effort meets with any success or not. If it doesn't, I think we have an ongoing issue that could be rather delicate. But if there is a consensus at the OECD to move forward on these, then I think we're on a different track and a potentially much easier track.
Right, but I mean, the bill before Parliament will presumably have passed before anything happens on the OECD front. So we will have, I guess there could be a period of time where our tax exists and we're waiting for the rest of the OECD to catch up.
That's quite possible. But if the OECD does manage to reach a point where all of the participants agree to sign on to an outcome, then I think that that kind of outcome on a broader basis would mean we wouldn't need the DST in Canada anymore. That
Right.
would essentially eliminate the need. So if that process does move ahead, then very much a different kind of space where it would be less contentious.
Let's move to the elephant in the room, which is Donald Trump.
Yes.
After it was concluded, I mean, he initiated the whole thing, and after it was concluded, he said the USMCA was the fairest, most balanced and beneficial trade agreement we have ever signed. And yet his trade agenda calls for a tariff of at least 10% on all $3 trillion worth of US imports. Mm-hmm. Now, there are plenty of reasons, obviously, why this might not happen, not least of which would be retaliation from Europe, Canada and Mexico. But if it did, how optimistic are you that Canada could sidestep the 10% tariff on everything in the same way that we got a side deal with Joe Biden on autos, so that the tax credit covered North American vehicles, not just American?
Well, I think that's the big question about that particular initiative. Is it truly going to be 10% on all imports from all sources, or is the U.S. going to exempt free trade partners, in particular Canada and Mexico? And that will be key. If the decision is not to exempt Canada and Mexico from that 10% tariff, then yes, we're into a whole new world where the U.S. would clearly be in breach of the new agreement. They would be in breach of every trade agreement they have with such a measure, and would likely have to face reactions from all those that are going to be hit with those tariffs.
How disastrous would it be for Canada to be hit with a 10% tariff on everything?
It would be a big blow, and I think I think probably even bigger factor for Canada is what would happen around the world, because if the U.S. takes this position and applies it against all countries, then virtually all countries are going to react in some way. Most will retaliate by raising tariffs against U.S. imports. And I think the U.S. really risks being left behind because everyone else is not talking about imposing those kinds of tariffs against each other. So the U.S. risks being left behind as other countries move forward, and at a disadvantage because their access to export markets would not be as advantageous as others.
And the experience of the first go-round was not great, right? I mean, I know there was a Federal Reserve study that found a net decrease in manufacturing employment due to tariffs in 2019. And I think the International Trade Commission study found that American companies and consumers would bear the brunt of any tariff. So from a logical point of view, it does not seem to be a smart move, but I guess that does not mean it won't happen.
No, it does not seem like a smart move at all, in particular for the U.S., because they're just going to increase costs for consumers. They're likely going to increase the inflation rate by doing that, and they're going to face retaliation from others. So the policy is very questionable. I mean, we've seen for instance, the Biden administration recently raised tariffs against China, but in a more strategic fashion, targeting specific areas. Trump's proposals have talked about a 60% tariff or more against all imports from China. So a very different kind of an approach.
One of the things that worked, at least from where I was sitting last time, was that this Team Canada effort to win over state governors, chambers of commerce, unions, whoever might have had an impact on the White House. We weren't prepared for Trump in 2016. Are we any better prepared now for a second Trump 2.0?
Well, I hope we are. We should be, because I think the kind of planning that would have been nice to have had completed before 2016, we should be doing that planning now. We should be preparing for a potential negotiation. We should be preparing to have to retaliate against actions if there are such measures, such as the 10% tariff. All of that should be planned out with opening positions, fallbacks, other fallbacks, all the strategy developed. All of that should be well underway at this point, just to get ready for it all.
Did you find, from your position at the table, that these efforts were helpful?
Oh, yeah. Well, particularly on the preparations for a negotiation, all of the consultations with the private sector, all of the just thinking through the strategies. I think that's what carried us through and ended up with a result that was really not that bad from a Canadian perspective. Because the thing that I've always found is that when you're negotiating with the U.S., if you prepare a lot more than they do, if you think about the issues a lot more than they do, understand the issues a lot more than they do, they don't tend to do as much of that kind of work because they're in a different position where they think they can dictate the terms. But if you've done all the preparations, you have an advantage at the end of the day.
They had a pretty hardball guy heading their negotiations, in Robert Lighthizer.
Yes.
I mean, the comment in the US at the moment seems to be that while Trump was constrained and advised by professionals last time, this time might be different. Do you have any indication that or is it always going to be a professional effort from the US when it comes to trade negotiations?
Well, we certainly hope it's a professional effort. And I actually I met with Robert Lighthizer a couple of weeks ago at an event, and we had a bit of a conversation. So I wouldn't be surprised if he's back in the Trump administration, which I think we should actually take some comfort from, because he is a professional. He's been doing this kind of thing for a long time. But I think a greater concern is that a Trump presidency wouldn't be surrounded by the same kind of expertise that he was the last time. And then who knows what. Because even last time, a number of the proposals they had in the negotiations did not make a lot of sense, even for the U.S. So we're hoping that they get good, solid technical advice.
It intrigues me a little bit. I mean, Lighthizer obviously is a professional. He's been doing it a long time, as you say. Does he buy into the idea that a 10% tariff would be a smart move?
I don't know. I haven't heard him comment on that at all, but I think he's very much supportive of tariffs against China, very high tariffs against China, but I think he would likely favor a more targeted approach rather than an across-the-board approach that hits fair traders, unfair traders, everyone the same way.
I mean, I guess from his point of view, it's almost helpful to have a rogue president who says these wild things, and nobody knows whether to believe him or not, and that strengthens your negotiating position.
It introduces a lot of anxiety, concerns, and you're not really sure where you stand. But I would say that Robert Lighthizer also had some very extreme ideas from our perspective that were a concern through the negotiations. So even like
what, for example?
Well, he had originally proposed that the agreement terminate after 4 years. And that was the early iteration of the review clause, which all of us rejected out of hand, because an agreement that's only going to last 4 years doesn't provide any certainty for investors, it doesn't allow plans for growth. It wouldn't have been worth even doing a 4-year agreement. He also came up with some fairly radical proposals on the autos area. He was against dispute settlement panels as they are now. He wanted to go back to the old system under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, where you could voluntarily either accept a panel result or not. You didn't have to. So not binding dispute settlement, which is something that we insist on in any of these kinds of agreements.
I mean, this sounds like pretty dry stuff to most people, I guess, but this is kind of existential for Canada. We've got to get this right, yeah?
We do have to get it right because, we rely so heavily on the U.S. market. We're so integrated with the U.S. market. If that is disrupted, that's a major economic shock to Canada. And that's something that we would have a great difficulty adjusting to if we're not in that kind of position where we have good, solid, assured access to the U.S. market. I
mean, I know I've asked you this in a different fashion, but could we adjust? We've got trade deals with Europe and some Asian countries, but you can't really replace the destination of 3/4 of your exports, right?
No, well, that's just it. The U.S. market is an easy market for Canada. Similar types of similar language, similar values, similar approaches on how you deal back and forth, and they're close. The European market, for example, which would be an alternative since we have an agreement there, is much more complicated, more difficult to get into. And replacing the U.S. market, where we have such a heavy reliance on it right now, is just not an option.
Great. Well, Steve, thank you very much for your time and your expertise. Be well. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much.